In this application, we're going to connect to both a SQL server and a MySQL database server. The purpose of connecting to both is to demonstrate how similar the interface is to both database systems. So first, let's look at how we connect to the SQL Server database. I've put the connection code in a separate file. The first thing we do is define our environment. So we are going to connect to, in this case, a server that is local to my virtual machine, my username and password, and the database that I'm going to connect to. I put those values into local variables from which I then create an associative array which I assign to the connection info variable. Again, I create an associative array using the connection information, assign that to a variable named connection info. Then I call SQL Server Connect, SQL SRV underscore connect, passing it two arguments. The first, the name of the server, and the second, the connection information for the server. The return from this function is a handle to the database server, and it is this handle that's going to allow me to interface with the database, that is, to send SQL commands to the database. If for some reason there's a failure in creating the handle, SQL Server Connect will return false. So I test for that on line 11. And if I've had an issue creating the connection to the database, I throw an exception and catch it in the catch block on line 16. Similarly, to connect to the MySQL database, I create local variables to store the values of the connection information. So the name of the host, the name of the user, the password, and the name of the database to which I want to connect. Now again, my environment is different than yours. I run SQL Server and MySQL local on this virtual machine. It is likely that your database system will be in a hosted environment. Therefore, to connect to your database, you will use a different value for the DB host. And to find that value, you should check with your hosting provider. So then to connect to the database, I call MySQL I underscore connect, and I pass it the connection information. In this case, I pass it four variables: the location of the server, the username, the password, and which database on the server that I wish to connect to. And again, MySQL I underscore connect will either return the handle, the connection to the database, or it will return false. So on line 10, I test the return value, and if the MySQL handle variable is false, then I handle that error in the if block code, throw an exception, which I handle on line 16. With the code in both of these files creating the connection to the database for me, I can now go to my application code and simply require the inclusion of those files into my application file. So I use a require once and bring both of those files into my application. So the first thing we're going to do is define the SQL statements that we want to use to retrieve and to insert data into these databases. So I define a select statement. Notice the keyword select, the star from movies. The star means give me everything that's in the table. So select everything from movies. That's the SQL statement that we're storing in the variable SQL select. Now for the insert statement, because there is a slight difference in the syntax of the insert statements between SQL Server and MySQL, I've created two variables here, one for each of the database systems. For the SQL Server, my insert statement is insert into this database. this table. Movies is the database, movies is the table. These are the columns into which I want to insert, and the values that I want to insert into those columns are listed following the values keyword. So to insert into a database, we use the keyword insert into some database, some table. The columns that we want to insert into, the keyword values, followed by the list of values that we want to insert within a set of parentheses. In the MySQL insert statement, the only difference is in the addressing of the database and the table. Notice that there is only one period, one dot between the database name movies and the table name movies. So we insert into the database movies, into the table movies, for these columns, keyword values, and then the values that we want to insert into those columns in parentheses following the keyword values. Then a echo statement to delineate which data we're going to be looking at. Then I send the query to the SQL Server database system. And to do that, I call this function SQL Server underscore query. SQL SRV underscore query. What that function requires is two arguments: the handle to the connection and the SQL statement that we want to execute against the server. This function will return the results of the execution of that query, and we assign those results to a variable named results. To expose you to what you might see in some PHP code, I wanted to show the or die clause. This is the old form of error handling. If this function fails for some reason, if this function call fails for some reason, then this instructs the PHP preprocessor to report the errors. So this was pre-try-catch exception handling. And the only reason I've left it here is to expose you to it so that if you see this in older code, you'll know what it is. So now we have the results in our results variable, and we want to iterate over those results and print out the data that we've received from the database system. We use a while loop, and we ask the while loop to iterate while there are results being returned by the SQL Server underscore fetch underscore array function. What this function does is it takes the contents of the results variable that's holding the data that we received from the database system, turns that into an associative array using the column names as a key and the values returned. We can iterate through that set of results and print those values. Now we want to insert a value. And again, the insert statement we defined up here. Now we're going to execute it. Again, we use the same command, SQL Server underscore query. We pass it a handle to the SQL Server connection, and we pass it the insert statement. Now the result here is going to be the number of rows that were affected by the insertion. What we're interested in is verifying that the data that we asked to be inserted was actually inserted. So we're going to verify that. We're going to simply rerun our select statement. On line 44, this line is just setting up our SQL select statement, and we're repeating our while loop to print the results from the select statement, which should include a new row of data, that new row of data that we just inserted here on line 40. Then I do exactly the same thing with the MySQL database. Once I've gotten the connection to it, I call the MySQL I underscore query. Very similar to the SQL Server query, MySQL I query takes the handle to the MySQL connection and the select statement. Now in this case, the select statement is universal, so we're going to use the same select statement. In this result, we're looking at results from the MySQL database server, not the SQL Server database server. So when we iterate through the results from this query, we're iterating the same way. The results contain all of the data from the select statement. The MySQL I fetch array creates an associative array using the column names as the keys, which we can iterate through in the while loop, and we do that. Then we're going to run the insert command on the MySQL database. And again, MySQL I underscore query, I pass the MySQL connection handle and the insert statement. What's returned from this call is the number of rows that are affected. But again, we're not that interested in the number of rows that were affected. What we really want to see is the validation of the insertion. So we're going to rerun the select statement. So we're calling MySQL I query, and this time we're passing the select statement with the MySQL connection handle, and we're going to iterate over those results again. So remember that the MySQL I fetch array, just like the SQL Server fetch array, creates an associative array using the column names as the keys, which we can use to iterate over the results. And I've got all of this wrapped in a try block, and my catch for any exception that occurs within this block is defined on 104. So let's run this and see what we get. Okay, so we've got our SQL Server data. This was the data that was in the server when we did the select before the insert statement. Now we do the insert, and now we're going to print the data after the insert statement. And the data that we've inserted is the Star Trek Wrath of Khan movie information on the MySQL database side. We selected and printed the values that existed in the table prior to our insert. We performed the insert. After the insert, we have a new record, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan movie information. In this demonstration, we've successfully selected from and inserted to both the SQL Server database and the MySQL database. And we've done that in the same application using the connections that we created for those databases.